Southern France, May 12, 1944. Hauptmann Ernst Vogel rested his hand on a folded reconnaissance sheet, the paper trembling under a palm calloused from stick and throttle. His left eye narrowed against the bright Provençal sun, while the other, the steady one, scanned the crude sketches of an enemy profile. The briefing room smelled of sweat, evaporated fuel, and boiled coffee. He let out a short laugh, the sound thin and brittle, and passed the sheet to Lowton and Karl Meyer with an offhand remark about how yet another Allied machine would follow the same predictable lines. The Luftwaffe had faced American fighters before and found them heavy, sturdy, but predictable. The doctrine favored energy retention, boom then zoom, and the German pilots trusted their philosophy like a sharpened blade. They had stacks of victories scribbled into logbooks, and habit breeds confidence. What Vogel and his pilots did not know at that table was that within 6 weeks, a new metric would appear in their after-action reports and force a rewriting of assumptions about what made a fighter decisive. The number that would haunt them was simple and brutal. The Hellcat, a plane they had mocked as a carrier truck, would begin to define a new kind of air superiority, and by the end of the year, the Axis facing it in the Mediterranean would count losses that no doctrine alone could explain. The theater in which Vogel operated had a recent history of dominance earned by machines that combined light weight, responsive control, and a high climb rate. For years, the Bf-109 and the FW-190 had been the measuring sticks. Their pilots taught to exploit the energy fight, to use stored potential and precise throttle management to trade altitude for position. They had won dogfights by refusing to be drawn into prolonged turning fights that favored the Allied designs of lighter radial engine fighters. The Luftwaffe's success in the early years rested on doctrine married to a machine that fitted. Briefing slides showed the Bf-109's weight-to-power ratios, its roll rate, and examples of textbook engagements in which speed and climb trumped numbers. Veteran voices filled the hangar with a kind of quiet authority. Oberleutnant Hans Becker recounted a winter sortie over Sicily when he had sent 2 Spitfires spiraling out of formation with a single deflection shot. There was a pride in the records, in the way the airframe matched the strategy. The airfield smelled of oil and old leather. The fabric of the parachutes left faint iodine tangs in the tents. And the pilots spoke in clipped syllables about conserved energy and positional discipline. They were convinced that any newcomer that could not outclimb, outdive, or outrun their machines would be reduced to scrap by training and tactics. Into that certainty arrived a brief and exasperating intelligence leak. Reports from convoy escorts over the Mediterranean described an American fighter different from what the pilots had assumed. The preliminary specs were sparse and a robust radial engine in a thick cowling, heavy armor around the cockpit, a thick fuselage that suggested a slow but survivable design. The initial technical brief called it a powerhouse that traded maneuverability for protection and endurance. The tone in the reports hinted at disdain. At a press of the lips in the intelligence tent, Sergeant Otto Brandt muttered that the Americans kept building truck fighters and calling them Victory. Commanders who had only read range and empty weight figures dismissed it as another overbuilt machine that would die when faced with the measured violence of German tactics. Their calculations were neat arithmetic, predicated on the belief that a heavy fighter could be picked apart by a light shark one before it closed. A micro-anecdote circulated among the pilots. In the officers' mess, Lieutenant Meyer had poked a photograph of the new plane with a fork and declared that one could land a supply pallet on its back. Laughter followed. The mockery, practical and precise, underscored the deep seam of confidence that would soon break. The first encounter was not the roar of a full-scale engagement, but a sliver of clarity that rearranged the map. It happened on a late afternoon over a stretch of sea that glinted like spilled mercury, when Vogel and 2 flightmates moved to intercept a force reported near a convoy. They climbed through a thin band of cloud. The wind smelled of salt and warmed metal.
The Germans expected a lumbering, heavily built machine that could be bullied off a fight with altitude management. Instead, they saw the Hellcat sitting in the sky like a compact shadow, its fuselage broad but its lines honest and purposeful. Oberleutnant Becker's voice on the open line was edged with curiosity more than contempt. "That cowling is large," he said, "but it does not look like a slow belly." Captain James Cole on the other side, his accent clipped, answered with a calm the German pilots heard through the static. "Keep your speed. We will not trade too low." The first minute of contact was a tangle of radio calls, throttle adjustments, and the metallic rasp of wind across canopies. The German pilots tried textbook moves. Vogel dived to gain speed. Meyer tried to pull into a high-performance scissors. Becker slid the control stick with clinical precision. The Hellcats, however, kept their energy in ways the German men did not expect. They could accelerate out of a turn with deception, climbing back onto the attacker like a tide pulling a boat unexpectedly. The sensory detail of that fight remained simple and sharp in their memories. The smell of burned resin from the wings as gunfire clipped paint, the vibration of cannon through the seat, the taste of wet metal in the mouths of men who had felt machine and man meet. A single exchange of fire changed the tone of the afternoon. A wingman on Vogel's flight, Feldwebel Otto Brandt, felt a thump
on his fuselage and saw the Hellcat peel away with a smile in its paint. The personal note from that first clash was small but corrosive. The Allies had not matched the Germans on a single obvious metric the pilots had been using. They had found a plane that refused to behave predictably within existing equations. The theory of air combat shifted quietly in the following weeks as pilots, engineers, and commanders debated the cause of the Hellcat's resilience. The new paradigm rested on a combination of structural robustness, power margin, and an operational doctrine that valued sustained energy rather than pure lightness. At base, the Hellcat used an engine with a broad torque curve and a propeller designed to bite in a way that allowed the plane to regain energy in short bursts. The American doctrine for carrier-based fighters was not purely about dogfighting finesse, but about survivability, quick recovery, and sustained interception. Instructor voices from naval flight schools intercepted in translation emphasized climb with throttle management, armored cockpits, and ammunition supply large enough to allow brief but effective bursts, followed by repositioning. This was not a single revolutionary secret, but a system of choices. The Hellcat's thicker wing center section allowed more fuel and sturdier landing gear for carrier operations, and those design decisions translated into a plane that could absorb punishment, keep its pilot alive, and still manage an energy comeback. Tactically, this meant that the German pilots, who measured engagements in short, violent arcs where the lighter fighter sought to bleed the heavier one, were now facing an opponent that could take a punch, delay, and then hit in a different energy band. Trainers who had once scoffed at armor began to recite the mathematics of mass and momentum differently, recalculating climb rates and time to intercept. The smell of rubber and oil in the hangars became the scent of a machine whose value was not obvious on a checklist, but deadly in the sky. Alongside tactical reconsideration came practical failures in the system that amplified the Hellcat's effect. The Luftwaffe was already stretched thin. Pilot hours truncated by attrition and fuel shortages. Training hours had been slashed as operations replaced instruction, and new pilots found themselves briefed on doctrine rather than given the flight time needed to internalize its subtleties. Logistics hiccups meant spare props and replacement airframes lagged behind demand. Dieter Kruger, a chief engineer responsible for the two groups' engine shop, kept a ledger of hours flown versus maintenance capacity, and the numbers told a bleak story. Aircraft that needed overhauls were pressed back into service with temporary fixes. The German training syllabus required a rhythm of practice climbs, high-speed recoveries, and measure G for a pilot to master energy conservation. Those hours were a currency the squadron lacked. The Americans, by contrast, leveraged a mass production system that allowed frontline replacement of damaged aircraft and a flow of pilots who could rotate through carrier units with varied experience. The Hellcat's tolerance for rough handling and its ability to absorb frontal and wing hits made it forgiving for crews learning combat on the fly.
In practical terms, this meant that when a Luftwaffe pilot, undertrained and underrested, found himself against a Hellcat, his margin for error evaporated. The system failure was not a single breakdown, but a cumulative deficit in fuel, flight hours, and spare parts that turned tactical disadvantages into calamities. The first decisive battle that forced a reevaluation occurred over a convoy transit route north of Corsica. Two German Staffel, led by Vogel and Becker, intercepted a mixed Allied escort group. The soundscape that morning was composed of engines and the creak of carrier deck planks sent on the breeze by the carrier's downwash in the distance. Visibility was high, and the sea flashed like a broken mirror. Vogel's voice was steady. "We will close from above and cut them in half," he said. Karl Meyer replied with a crisp affirmative, and Hans Becker checked his gun indicators out loud. The Germans stacked in altitude and dove. The Hellcats were flying low, hugging the convoy like guard dogs, their pilots clearly coordinating. As the fighters converged, a series of short radio exchanges defined the choreography of death and survival. "Cold to goop, left outbound, keep 3000, came the calm American voice. "Vogel, I have a bogey at your 7 o'clock, Meyer reported, a trace of static in his words. "I see him," Vogel answered, hands tight on the stick. Then came a cascade of movement that the technical manuals did not fully explain. The Hellcats, when pierced by a burst, did not explode in a tidy arc. Instead, they rolled, fed power, and recovered into a climb that put chasing Bf-109s into a low-energy state. The German pilots found themselves in a tail chase, their speed bleeding off, fuel and ammunition spent trying to force a result that never came. The sensory ledger was stark. The shell of white paint sputtered flaking metal from the wing roots. The taste of fear was metallic on every tongue. At the end of the morning, the Luftwaffe reported 3 lost aircraft and the Allies minimal damage. The ratio in that action was small in the arithmetic of a single fight, but significant in effect. It taught a brutal lesson about the cost of mismatch between doctrine and a system built to survive, absorb, and return. A second clash, larger and more consequential, took place several weeks later during a planned interdiction of Allied air cover near a harbor. Intelligence suggested concentrated carrier-based fighters were refueling and rotating. Vogel's Staffel was committed to a surprise attack. The weather turned suddenly, thickening into a white blanket that muffled sound and dissolved shapes. The fog carried the damp smell of seaweed and machine oil. The German group dove through the cloud into a scene of sudden violence where the Allies had the advantage of numbers and a practice of mutual support. The Hellcats arrived in pairs and trios, using coordinated throttle and wing position to force Bf-109s into unfavorable arcs. This was planning turned into motion, and the material was not just machine capability, but doctrine integrated with carrier operations that allowed rapid rearming and return to fight. In the brutal calculus of the engagement, the Germans lost 5 aircraft to 7 Hellcats, while inflicting 2 confirmed losses. Commanders on both sides radioed in terse reports. "Hayes to fleet, control has the situation," cried Commander Robert Hayes. Vogel, wounded and furious, called for a retreat. Dialogues between pilots that day became compressed shards of human sound. 8 to 10 exchanges each time a pair of fighters closed. Voices jagged with urgency, pride, and the lived knowledge of metal failing under stress. After the battle, the tally placed the exchange in a larger statistical narrative. The numbers hinted at a ratio that favored the Hellcat when combined with operational depth. Those figures did not exist as a single smoking gun, but as a pattern. The Germans began to speak of the Hellcat less as a curiosity and more as a systemic problem. The human backstory that shaped Hauptmann Ernst Vogel helps explain why the arrival of the Hellcat hit him with unique force. Vogel was 31, a pilot who had grown up on a northern plateau where wind taught patience. He joined the air service as a young man and had earned his rank through a string of disciplined sorties where he relied on the doctrinal edge taught to him at simulators and airfields. His childhood included afternoons spent disassembling bicycle gears, a deliberate curiosity that turned toward engines and the mathematics of torque. In the academy, his instructors praised his methodical approach and his calm under fire. He married a school teacher named Marta the winter before the campaign in Italy, and letters from her kept a steady pulse in his life even as missions multiplied. Vogel's defining trait was a conservatism of approach born from precise training and a refusal to gamble beyond controlled variables. That conservatism had served him well, but it made adaptation slower. He trusted doctrine and the machines that embodied it. When confronted by an opponent that did not yield to his rules, his reaction was not immediate cleverness, but a slow, painful recalibration. The letters from Marta, the smell of her perfume in the tent, and the schematic notes in his flight jacket all belonged to the background of a man who had been measured by successes until a machine arrived that demanded a different measurement. The backstory contains within it the paradox that would drive his personal arc. His pride, his love of ordered systems, and the mechanical curiosity that had once led him to success would become the tools he used to learn a new way to fight. That learning would cost men and machines, and its cost would reshape his judgment about what an ace had to be.
The antagonist of this story is not a single pilot, but a system embodied in the Hellcat and the industrial and doctrinal machinery that produced it. Captain James Cole had his own backstory that informs the Allied side of the narrative. He was 28, a Navy pilot who had sailed from New York on a carrier with a crew that treated the vessel like a living thing. Cole had learned to fly at a small civilian airfield where mornings smelled of cut grass and old fabric. He had been assigned to a carrier task force and had been trained to land on a pitching deck, to trust the arrestor wire, and to read the sea like a map. His operational belief centered on mutual support and the idea that a pilot was part of a larger system that included deck crews, maintenance, radar operators, and command. He understood that his plane was designed to be returned to battle quickly. Where Vogel represented doctrine internalized into muscle memory for single-plane superiority, Cole represented doctrine that made resilience, logistics, and rotation part of tactical thinking. This philosophical split between individual virtuosity and systemic robustness lies at the heart of the encounters that follow. 3 moments of tension expanded the narrative and crystallized the stakes that both sides faced. The first moment was a close pass in which Vogel nearly collided with a Hellcat while trying to force a firing solution. For 6 heated paragraphs in their reports, the 2 men described the visual blur of rivets, the sudden spray of shell casings, and the sound of a canopy that vibrated like a bell. The scene lasted only seconds, but it was cataloged as an event that changed how pilots judged engagement distances. The second moment involved a carrier deck fire on an Allied ship 2 days after a major engagement. Flames leapt, and the smell of charred canvas filled the air. The Hellcats on deck were scrambled, and through a haze of smoke the pilots launched, engines screaming with a pitch that left a ringing in the ears. The tactical detail here is how the Hellcat fleet responded to damage with coordinated rearming that put fighters back into the sky within an hour. That operational resilience surprised Luftwaffe intelligence and forced a strategic rethink. The third moment was a long night mission where radar contact produced a cluster of contacts, and the Germans, low on fuel, attempted a risky interception. In the darkness, the Hellcats used vectoring from carriers to exact precise positions, and their pilots coordinated via short, clipped radio phrases. The Germans were caught between the vectors and expended their limited ammunition in attempts to close distance. Each of these moments is described in painstaking detail and contains sensory markers of smell, touch, and sound that anchor the reader to the immediacy of the fight. Interwoven with human drama are technical explanations that clarify how the Hellcat functioned as a system. The F6F used a Pratt & Whitney radio engine mated to a large diameter prop that allowed a higher thrust coefficient at typical carrier engagement speeds. Structurally, the wing center section had larger spars and integral fuel tanks that increased survivability and range. The armor plate around the cockpit and the self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fatality in exchange for incremental weight.
The landing gear, designed for heavy carrier landings, folded into reinforced bays that distributed stress. In procedures, the carrier cycle allowed a rapid single-engine check, prop pitch adjustment, and a refueling and rearm sequence that took advantage of a standardized deck crew choreography. These technical elements combined produced a platform that could return to a fight, take hits, and maintain enough energy margin to re-enter the battle more often than comparable designs of the era. Engineers like Dieter Kruger could read the maintenance logs and see the effect in reduced turnaround times and increased sortie rates, which in aggregate produced overwhelming pressure on opposing forces with fragile logistics. The crisis point for Vogel and his staffel arrived on a day when the Mediterranean sky was a cobalt dome and radio chatter thickened into a chorus of commands. The German pilots were low on spares and morale when intelligence reported a substantial Allied fighter screen moving to intercept a convoy. Vogel ordered a climb that was curt and precise, and the dialogue in the cockpit echoed the stakes. Vogel to Meyer, "Keep your 6, he said. "I am on your right, I will cover," Meyer replied. "Becker, visuals on the deck, 2 Hellcats climbing," Becker said, voice thin with urgency. "Roger," Vogel answered, "we commit." The exchange between the pilots tallied 8 direct calls as they closed. In the fight that followed, Hellcats used their acceleration and structural tolerance to blunt the German attacks. Replay of gun camera footage afterwards highlighted that when a Hellcat was hit in the wing root, it still flew straight for several seconds and that its pilot could recover with a combination of power and elevator adjustments. The sensation described by survivors was one of a machine that would not fold under a single decisive blow. The Luftwaffe crews, sent to salvage what they could, spoke of the metallic taste left after inhaling vaporized hydraulic fluid and the ringing in ears that outlasted consciousness. The tactical failure here was not only in doctrine, but in the inability to adapt to a system that refused to be punctured by traditional methods. By late summer, the pattern was undeniable to those who paid attention. Loss ratios in certain encounters began to favor the Hellcat not because it was universally superior in every metric, but because it fit into a broader U.S. Navy system that valued replacement rate, pilot rotation, and carrier-based logistics. The figures that began to appear in action reports were stark and could not be dismissed as chance. Squadron by squadron, the arithmetic showed an advantage when the Hellcat fought within groups that could return to a carrier, be repaired, rearmed, and relaunched with persistent efficiency. In the eyes of commanders like Commander Robert Hayes, this was industrial warfare applied to the air. The German response was multifaceted and sometimes desperate. Training programs were accelerated for pilots like Karl Meyer, who spent long nights in simulating energy retention techniques modified for a target that could not be bullied into predictable behavior. Engineers tried to adjust prop pitch and climb angles, seeking a small mechanical edge that could be exploited. Feldwebel Otto Brandt kept a log of modifications attempted in the field and how few changed outcomes. Desperation bred extremes. As losses mounted, calls filtered up through the chain for radical measures. The Luftwaffe and naval units experimented with heavier cannon loads to try to ensure that when they did hit, the Hellcat would be fatally compromised. Pilots who had been trained to conserve ammunition now spoke of hot-loaded guns and looser engagement protocols. The cost was a rise in accidents and mechanical failures in the patrol routes. There were also moral and tactical shifts as crews considered sacrificial tactics to blunt the carrier groups. Some commanders urged massed attacks to overwhelm the Hellcat screen, a tactic that traded numbers for precision and increased the attrition rate of German pilots. In a grim echo of other theaters, pilot life expectancy fell as risky measures replaced the slow, measured doctrine that had built the Luftwaffe's early successes. The smell of cordite and the stench of burnt fabric became part of the base's identity as the human and mechanical cost of adaptation mounted. 3 months after the Hellcat entered sustained operations in the Mediterranean, the toll was felt beyond sorties and scorecards. Coastal towns saw convoys delayed and the rhythm of supply altered.
Engineers like Dieter Kruger tracked spare parts that simply did not exist and improvised components from captured crates. Pilots like Carl Meyer carried the physical weight of the fights, raking fingers across cockpit frames where shell splinters had lodged, tasting metal and salt on the air. Commanders revised strategy and moved to staggered patrols to avoid mass engagements where the Hellcats excelled. The Allied carriers, by contrast, coalesced doctrine into a predictable resilience. They practiced deck cycles until they were a ritual, crews moving like a single organism to relaunch fighters in a cyclical tide. These systemic differences have little romance in them, but they are decisive. 1 month after the decisive convoy skirmish, the immediate consequences had settled into new routines. Vogel spent long hours in the hangar studying gun camera footage, his uniform smelling faintly of oil and old books. He wrote a letter to Marta that was both tender and raw, confessing a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. The squadron had lost 3 men in the interception, and the base had a quiet that had nothing to do with absence of engines. Mechanically, the engineers had modified prop pitch angles to attempt to increase acceleration at specific RPM bands. These
changes yielded marginal improvements, but the underlying problem remained. Pilots rotated in with fresher hands from training units, but the shortage of seasoned mentors made the onboarding painful. Within the squadron, there was a nascent humility now, an acceptance that doctrine must evolve faster than they had allowed. The brief period of reflection after a month produced small changes. Night missions were altered to reduce predictable vectoring. Crews began to practice coordinated turn fights that would force American pilots to trade energy for position. The psychological landscape had shifted. Where once there had been laughter at the mention of a Hellcat, now there was a sober respect and a determination to learn. 3 months later, the changes became structural. The command adjusted rotation cycles and prioritized certain maintenance lanes to bolster the most stressed squadrons. Training hours were reintroduced where possible, and a new emphasis on mixed formation tactics emerged. Vogel found himself leading an experimental flight designed to exploit group tactics and to force Hellcats into situations where the German fighters could apply their energy advantage in concert. The cost was high and the payoff uneven. In some engagements, the group tactics produced isolated successes, but they required a level of coordination in flight time the Luftwaffe could scarcely afford. Logistical reality kept intruding. Supplies, especially specialized parts for prop pitch adjustments, arrived irregularly. The Allied carriers, meanwhile, had refined their already efficient cycles, and their kill ratios stabilized in their favor in localized theaters. The war of attrition in the air became as much about factories and docks as about pilots above the waves. 6 months after the Hellcat first altered the fight, history had drawn its outline. The tactical manuals were being rewritten in small official margins. Vogel, wounded twice in the interval, sat as a member of a small board that would submit recommendations to higher command. The recommendations conceded that a single ace could not carry a doctrine that required systemic support. They insisted on increased flight hours for newcomers, standardized repair protocols, and an allowance for heavier cannon when the intelligence suggested carrier-based opponents. The epilogue of those months was both pragmatic and haunted. In the Mediterranean campaigns, the Hellcat and the system that produced it had forced a cost paid in pilots and pride. The lesson, ultimately, was not that one machine had been an absolute superior, but that the combination of industrial capacity, resilient design, and operational doctrine could overcome doctrinal purity. In quiet moments, Vogel would remove his flight jacket and read Marta's letters. Imagine a future where the calculus of violence was measured in returned men and not merely in territorial gains. The post-conflict engineering postmortem drew conclusions that would be taught in academies for decades. Inspectors cataloged the Hellcat's structural resilience, pointing to thicker spars and redundant systems that allowed flight even with severe wing damage. The maintenance records showed that a standardized deck crew choreography and quick change procedures for fuel and ammunition gave the carriers an operational tempo that land-based airfields could not match in contested seas. Radar integration for vectoring fighters into optimal engagement bands further multiplied the Hellcat's effectiveness. Historians would later call this a lesson in systems warfare, the powerful combination of machine, doctrine, and industrial throughput. The Hellcat was not a mythic sword, it was an engine of sustained operations. The moral judgment that emerged from these events was uncomfortable and complex. It was not a simple indictment of one army or another, but a reflection on how innovation in war rarely comes as a lone marvel. It arrives as a knitting together of design choices, production lines, and logistical thought. The laughing German pilots had been right to scoff at the machine on paper, but the laughter obscured a larger truth. Machines are effective when they are part of a system, and doctrine must account for the force multiplier that industrial rhythm provides. Vogel learned this at a cost. He learned to respect systems as he once had admired machines. If you are watching and you felt the same mix of surprise and curiosity that Vogel felt when he first saw that broad cowling and underestimated it, tell us which invention you think changed a war the most. Start your comment with "My choice is" and name the machine and why. Your comments help shape future episodes where we dig into the engineering details and personal stories behind the machines. We read every thoughtful reply, and your suggestions guide which archives we pull from next. Now, returning to the day that reframed everything, consider how a single number can change strategy and how a system can render doctrine obsolete. The final accounting of human and material cost is stark in numbers and quieter in memory. The Hellcat would go on in other theaters to wreck favorable kill ratios where operational conditions matched its strengths. The Mediterranean engagements taught the Luftwaffe painful lessons about adaptation under scarcity. Vogel's last report, written in a cramped hand on a bench lined with oil stains, summarized what he had learned. No single tactic is forever. No machine is invincible. And the machinery of war is as much about factories and decks as it is about pilot skill. The laughter that began the story had been replaced by the sound of maintenance crews working through the night and pilots reading bullet-riddled logs. Those records turned into doctrine and then into history. This is not simply an account of metal and mathematics. It is a story about how people respond to surprise, how institutions bend or break under new pressures, and how the measure of a plane is not only in its maximum climb rate or top speed, but in how it is maintained, fed, and returned to combat. In the end, the lesson carried forward was elegiac and practical. Engineers study these fights not to glorify destruction, but to understand how design choices ripple across strategy and human lives.
If you found value in this examination of technology, doctrine, and cost, subscribe and join us as we continue to unpack the machines that altered the course of conflict. The plane that seemed a truck became a system that reshaped the sky, and in that inversion lies a hard truth about modern war.